So I really love our children, actually, sometimes more than the adults, right? I'm just kidding. So you'll never know. So this is Main Street, Boonville, Mississippi, where I was born and raised for the first part of my life, 8,000 souls. At 11, many of you know I moved out of Boonville with my aunt and uncle, my Auntie Annabelle, who's famously said, "Honey child, humans is just messy," and her husband, Uncle Clarence Joe. We moved to the south side of Chicago, which was a massive city. So you take this individual that lived in a town of just over 8,000 to the south side of Chicago. And to be honest, I don't really remember a lot about the first 11 years of my life. But Chicago, I remember that city because it was huge and it was so incredibly big for a boy from Mississippi. And fast forward, after graduating from college in Chicago, I went to Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. The strange thing was, upon my graduation from seminary as a middle 20-year-old seminary graduate with all sorts of ideals, I ended up in Wayne, Nebraska, of all places. How many of you have heard of Wayne, Nebraska? Oh my goodness. Why? And this is where Wayne State College is located. So Wayne, Nebraska was actually smaller than Boonville. It was about 5,500 people. And the university had about 5,500 students. So the university here was as large as the town. Of course, it was surrounded by corn and bean fields. So I was called by Grace Lutheran Church to start a campus ministry presence on the campus of Wayne State. Not Wayne State, Detroit, but Wayne State, Nebraska. And of course, when they called that out at our call committee, in front of all my family and relation that happened to be there and friends, they said Wayne State. And of course, everybody thought Detroit, and they found out it was Nebraska, which was very, very different. But I was called there to do campus ministry, youth, and evangelism because you always give your associate pastor the things you don't like to do, right? That the other pastors don't like to do. So it was an exciting time for me in Wayne, Nebraska. The work on the campus flourished. And by the way, what else could you do in a town of 5,500 people but go to the campus ministry, right? There wasn't a lot of options there. But in my first week of being in Wayne, Nebraska, I got some advice from the only other gay man that I met in Wayne, Nebraska. He happened to run the clothing store, which is called Swans, which is still there to this day. And this is an inside picture of, well, there's the inside picture of Swans. And his name was Jim, and he gave me this advice. He said, "Don't make enemies here. You need to be nice to everybody in a small town because you'll end up running into that person that you insulted in the grocery store. Maybe not this week, but eventually you will." And then he said, "You'll need to learn to smile a lot. You'll learn to be really nice because niceness works its way into you here in Wayne, Nebraska." He said, "This is a land where there's a slow pace of life and social orbits constantly overlap." And he said, "The waiter that I called out for botching my order at Popo's Cafe," which was one of the only cafes that was open early in the morning, to his surprise was also a volunteer firefighter who ended up at his house when his house was on fire. The mom who organized the annual Wayne Chicken Show that he trashed to her face about how unorganized it was, turns out to be running the dry cleaner in town. And that means he has to drive 45 minutes to either Norfolk, Nebraska, or to Sioux City, Iowa, to get his dry cleaning done. So he concluded with these words. He said, "Screw-ups in small-town Nebraska have a long life thanks to the grinding, omnipresent rumor mill that never seems to run out of grist." Here's a personal mantra. Life is an echo. How many of you have heard that? Life is an echo. What you send out comes back. What you sow, you reap. What you give, you get. What you see in others exists in you. Do not judge, so you will not be judged, because life is an echo. So my alternative is radiate and give love and love comes back to you. So last Sunday, I focused on shame. And I'm afraid that actually this sermon has an element of shame in it. But I hope you take it differently than that. And once you're shamed in a small town like Wayne, Nebraska, or Boonville, Mississippi, you carry that shame forever. And the whole point of the visitation story that we read last week, if you were here, of the risen Christ with his 7 disciples on the beach, on the shore, eating fish and bread, was to release Peter of his shame. That is at least the conclusion I had, to release Peter of his shame. Because we heard last Sunday that Peter denied Jesus 3 times as Jesus was being sentenced and executed to death. He said, I am not a follower of Jesus. I am not a follower of Jesus. I am not a follower of Jesus. The conversation around the fire on the beach was to release the shame that Peter felt about saying 3 times, I don't know you, Jesus. I'm not your follower. And of course, then he also gave them his marching orders. The marching orders was to feed and love those crazy human beings, Peter and the other disciples. Feed them food, physical food, feed them spiritual food. Now here is what happened with the rest of the story that I purposely left off to kind of create this story. So Jesus had declared to Peter and to the rest of the disciples that it was a shame-free zone, that it was a new start and a new opportunity. Now here's what is really profound in the story. I don't think Peter gets it yet. He doesn't get it, and immediately he turns around and he points the finger, and I'll point to Susan. He points the finger of judgment and shame on the youngest of the disciples, on John, the one who was often called Jesus' favorite or beloved disciple that we talked about last week. I love this painting by a friend of mine, Becky Jane Harrelson. It's an intimate snapshot of the young John and Jesus at the communion table. And Peter notices that the young disciple is following right on Jesus' heels, because Jesus said, let's get up from our breakfast and let's go and follow me. And John is right there on Jesus' heels. He's front and center. And Peter notices that, and he whispers into Jesus' ear, and he says, Jesus, what's up with him? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus responds, Peter, if I want John to live until I return to earth, what does that matter to you? But you, Peter, follow me. This is my paraphrase. Don't worry about how closely John is following me, how he seems to fall all over himself to be as close as he can to me. Stop competing, Peter. There's been a lot of jealousy going on between you and John, I'd say, for the last 3 years. Time to take care of your own stuff, Peter, and stop worrying about the other guy. The topic of judging others could actually be taught in a 2-word sermon, which you might appreciate. When it comes to hating, gossiping, ignoring, ridiculing, holding grudges, or wanting to cause harm, please apply the following and simply stop it. Peter, life is an echo. What you send out comes back. What you sow, you reap. What you give, you get. Life is an echo. My friends in the journey, we live in a world that is so full of judging right now. I don't have to go on about the world of judgment in which we live. How do we set aside what seems to be our natural propensity to judge? To make up stories in our heads about other people, I think like Peter was doing about John. How do we set aside jealousy and grudges and anger and bitterness, not only with our partners or our spouses or our households or our families, but with the world around us? Just because someone is different, just because somebody believes differently or looks differently or has different values or opinions, or whether they side with the elephant or the donkey, here is my great humorous reminder. Uh-oh, looks like you were so busy judging others that you forgot to close the closet and all your skeletons fell out. Ain't that the truth? So in 2 weeks, our associate pastor candidate will come to town. I'm going to give her a name. This may be her name or may not be her name, Susan. And she's going to preach at us. She will lead a couple of classes. She will have a meet and greet at a potluck. And guess what? We are going to judge the way she preaches. We're going to judge the way she looks. We're probably going to judge the outfit she wears. Is that appropriate for a pastor to wear? We will probably even judge how she interacts with each of us individually, or who she seems to favor or not. Well, to let you know a little bit about Susan, she spent the last 18 years living in South Africa. We don't know her story yet. She doesn't know our story. But as I see it, it's about the story we make together. It's about the journey we make together. It's about embracing each other and giving each other room to be, as Teresa said, to simply be. I found this ditty a few weeks ago, and this was our contemporary reading for today, which was, "Never compare your insides to everyone else's outsides." Anne Lamott takes credit for this, as well as a number of other authors and speakers. But back to Peter for a moment. Jesus, what about him, John? What about his outsides? He seems to be on the inside track. He's younger. He's prettier. He seems to be a little bit tighter with you, Jesus. I also look at the lives of others in my dark night of the soul. And I think they have made it, that their lives are better, that they are more beautiful, that their life is full of love and mine is lacking. That seems to be the kind of way we relate to other people. It's easy, especially on social media, to scroll through your feed and to look at all the pretty pictures of the people doing fabulous things while we're sitting in the darkness of depression or despair. I like to remind myself, don't compare your real life to someone else's controlled online content. So I encourage you today to share your story, to share your stories with each other. We don't know what is getting us out of bed in the morning or what is keeping us hiding underneath the sheets until noon. We just don't know. I'm a perfectionist. I'm a codependent. And I want to be loved by everybody. And I think I'm in good company because I think Peter was a perfectionist. I think Peter was also a codependent. And I think Peter wanted to be loved by everyone. But he wanted to be loved especially by Jesus. But here's the key. 1 Samuel says this: God does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. So there is a surprise ending to this story. And I didn't know the ending to the story, the alternative ending to the story, until I had a conversation with Reverend Tony from Beatitudes, and he shared this with me this week. He's a little bit more scholarly than I am. He gets more time to read. And he said that many scholars believe that this verse is actually translated incorrectly. That Peter wasn't looking just at little John, but he was looking at all the crowds of people that were hot on Jesus' heel and that were following him, and pointing to them and saying, so what about all of them? It wasn't just John. It could have been a whole crowd of people. What about all those people I'm going to compare myself to that I want to be like? And Jesus is saying, Peter, we're all in this together. We're all on the journey together. We are human beings. We are human and divine beings. You, Peter, follow me as I follow God. So when Jesus says, follow me, it wasn't just about the destination, but it was really about the ongoing journey. To Jesus and to Peter's question, each of us are a part of this beloved community. Even if it's your first time here, we consider you a part of us. We follow so differently. We all hear different voices, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. We all hear God speaking to us differently, calling us to different places, to different spaces, to different roles, to different positions. We're called to follow differently, but we're all called to be the hands and the feet of Jesus in the world. That's the beauty of the diversity of community, because together we can, alone it is more difficult. Kitty follows differently than I do. Alejandro follows differently than I do. Marlon, you follow differently than I do. Armour, you follow differently than I do. Vicky, you follow differently than I do. We hear a different voice calling us, but it is the same Spirit and the same God. And that's the beauty of community. So be with me in a moment of prayer. Oh, Holy One, we are grateful for these intrepid characters like Peter. We are thankful for us as characters in this place and this space who have all heard different calls. We don't compare ourselves to those around us or next to us or in the same household, but we simply live out what Spirit has declared us to be in any given moment, in any specific place. But in the words of Teresa, we are all called to simply be your instrument of love, your instrument of goodness, and your instrument of justice in our worlds. And the people of God said, amen.